Well, we will begin shortly. And can I just make sure that you all have received your grades for the midterm test? Hello, can you hear me? Okay. And can I just get a yes whether you received your grades for the midterm?
Yes.
Okay, I'll take those to mean yes, you did. All right. If you have questions, feel free to ask me about it and so forth. Some of you did not meet the minimum word requirement, which I'm surprised that. Please pay attention to that because that is important, and it unfortunately costs penalty in terms of the grade and so forth. When in some cases writing half that amount, and it's not just the words; it's the content itself that reflected not so much thought put into what was written. At least that's the impression that I received in some cases. Most likely, I put some comments there. You should see some comments in your essay, and if you have any response, then feel free to let me know. All right. So I think we're getting. Oh, it's 7. So let me begin today. I thought what I'd do is go through the questions that I asked and sort of tell you what I was sort of looking for and expecting in terms of response. And this will be helpful because in terms of even when you come to the final exam, it would be helpful to review these concepts as well. Going through it, let's just deal with each question. According to Halliday, what enables the meaning-making potential in language is the lexicogrammar. Thinking about meaning means thinking grammatically. What does it mean to think grammatically? And of course, think grammatically in response to the rest of what Halliday wrote, which was thinking about meaning. So thinking about meaning means thinking grammatically. In terms for Halliday, the focus is always on meaning, but how grammatically that meaning is realized. So when I asked you to write about this aspect of thinking grammatically, of course it goes back to the point that is made in the lectures, and that is that what enables the meaning-making potential in language is the grammar, lexicogrammar. Yes, Halliday does not distinguish between lexis and grammar. He says pretty much they're the same thing, but just on different clines, where the lexis is more delicate grammar, as he puts it, more detailed, so that as the choices are refined, they're refined down to the level of words. And of course, when he talks about, and this is really what I wanted you to get at, and that is when, on the one hand, you have meaning, we have the meta functions, but what and how are those meanings realized? They are realized through wording. What is wording? Wording is the lexicogrammar. And what does Halliday mean by grammar? Well, for him, grammar is not just the one student wrote that Halliday says that every sentence is grammatical. That's not what Halliday is saying here. He's not saying that grammatical in the sense that you can produce a completely nonsense sentence that has no meaning. That certainly is not grammatical. What gives it grammaticality is the knowledge about how the words combined together will produce a meaning. That kind of wording then refers back then to the process, participant, circumstance. These are the notions about what Halliday is referring to in terms of grammar. The choices, the choices that you make in terms of what you want to say, in terms of meaning, how that sort of translates into the wording. And so what you see on that column under wording, that is sort of what Halliday's talking about in terms of the grammar. Logical, dependent clauses, how the clauses are combined, parataxis, hypotaxis. Now, what I wanted you to illustrate was then through what we've discussed in class, looking at the texts themselves, how that use of lexical grammar here in terms of logical meaning, how that contributes to, well, in this case, the effectiveness of Obama's speaking, how it was received, how he was able to put it forward with a particular tempo, with a particular rhythm. It's because the patterning that almost gives it a kind of musicality. Now that's what thinking about meaning and thinking about what makes this effective and thinking about how people are responding to it, how they're responding to it, in many ways goes back to the grammar, goes back to the choices that are being made about the combinations of parataxis and hypotaxis and so forth. Mood, modality, reflecting interpersonal meaning. And again, the speech that Obama gave where the use of modality indicated his not only his certainty, will, repeated many times, but also the way in which he asserted his authority about what he is telling Congress they should do. Well, that is coming through the grammar. How he is reflecting on how he is expressing the interpersonal relations, how he is expressing the tenor of relations between him and who he is speaking to comes through in the choices of modality. And these are all examples that I discussed in class and gone through in terms of the review as well with you. When we come to looking at theme, well, one of the examples goes back again to the debate performance of Obama and Romney. And why did people respond positively to one and not to the other? Why was the first debate so inept as opposed to the last debate, which was supposed to be so much more well received? What made the difference? What made the difference? Goes back to the lexicogrammar, thinking about meaning, thinking about how people are responding to the message, thinking about that requires us to think grammatically in terms of the choices that are being made about how the clause begins, theme. The choices that Obama made with respect to the first debate influenced people's response. The fact that it was so diffuse, all mentioning so many things, never mentioning we, contrasts with the third debate, closing, where obviously he'd gotten some coaching that gave him a realization about what he needed to do. And that goes back to the choices that are related to the lexicogrammar. Choices that are also related to how we said, what is the importance of theme? Theme, the relationship to the method of development of the text, what it reveals, that kind of progression of choices, whether it's continuous. In this speech by Hu Jintao, the repetition, our cooperation as partners should be based, and repeating that. But at the same time, there's a kind of linear thematic progression from how it ends in paragraph 5 and then how it is picked up in 6, 7, 8, and 9. It shows an organization of the text. It gives us a sense of the coherent structuring. It reflects, it signposts for us how this text is mapped out and put together. So that's what I was looking for from the first question. The second question, metaphor. You had to know that I'd be asking you about metaphor. Halliday has introduced the idea of grammatical metaphor. Hassan introduced the idea of extended metaphor. And the idea that there's lexical metaphor, well, that's so already well established. But I'm asking you then, taking these three kinds of metaphor, and I tell you what they are, lexical, grammatical, and extended. But what I'm saying is that fundamental to this whole idea of metaphor is de-automatization. So the focus has to be on not just giving me illustrations of these three kinds of metaphor, which was fine, but also to reflect on this. How does de-automatization explain these three kinds of metaphor? Giving examples from the lectures. So lexical metaphor. I think there were so many of you that addressed this question. Yes, Tim is a rock. Okay, that was well established. But move on. Grammatical metaphor. The idea of congruence. For some of you in answering this, yes, you're very well aware. You understand this idea of the literal meaning, the congruent meaning. The idea that semantics and grammar are sort of linked up together, that as Halliday puts it, grammar is almost like under the control of semantics. But that does fit his idea. Semantics is given a priority. Our goal is to make meaning. The grammar really is the means by which we make meaning. So semantics exerts a kind of control over the grammar. And so that the congruent becomes the expected, the automatic, the default. Things are nouns, processes are verbs, but the whole idea of metaphor and de-automatization is that you can disconnect that connection between the meaning and the grammar. It doesn't have to be that expected realization. Instead, you can decouple it and recouple it a different way altogether. What's the importance of grammatical metaphor? The ability to innovate. Innovate at the level of structure, grammar. Verbs take on the qualities of nounness. Just like in the example of Tim as a rock, Tim takes on the qualities of rockness. Grammar itself, the categories of grammar, have a meaning. One of the obvious examples from the language of science was how this sort of happening, which is expressed in really clearly very verbal terms, is repackaged in a nominalization where the verb, it's no longer verbal, it's no longer the verbs, the processes are now nouns, and they are captured there. The happening turns into a something. Now, the case of Donald Jung, the remind versus reminder, right? That was an example that you could be using, and not just even from the language of science. It is something that really is predominant in much of the way that we speak and operate when it comes to writing, when it comes to education, when it comes to not just science. And it isn't even just university, it isn't even just academic. It's bureaucracy, governmental bureaucracy. Or if you even go work for a company, you have to be able to write in a way that is reflective of this sort of academic sophistication represented by one's ability to nominalize. So that there were plenty of examples to illustrate this. Now, that's grammatical metaphor. Extended metaphor. Extended metaphor had to do with, really, as we have discussed it, as Hassan describes it, verbal art. What's the difference between, yes, you have lexical metaphor, grammatical metaphor. What makes for an extended metaphor is when a text, when a poem itself acquires a kind of automatization. It acquires through the artist, giving it a kind of background. We called it the automatic. We called it the default, a kind of where a background is created against which the poet foregrounds, creates a particular meaning. Now, what was necessary here was not just to say there's foregrounding and the poem means this. No, how does the poem come to mean what it does? Signs take on a deeper meaning. How does that come about? Hassan calls it symbolic articulation. The expression that we've used comes from Professor David Button, mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice into a non-habitual consistency, taking the way we use language and creating a pattern. That pattern becomes the background, becomes the automatic against which the poet then repatterns, breaks the automatic, de-automatizes to point out some particular theme, some hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. It isn't just the theme, it's what Hassan says the patterns of language are so deployed. It's a patterning. It takes you in a particular direction. Each message by itself, and as I mentioned to you before, that means each clause by itself is a message. Yes, it's a clause, but it's the totality of all these clauses. This is the point of the extended metaphor. It isn't just within one clause. It isn't just one word. It is a totality of the clauses that make up the text that creates this extended metaphor. The theme, as she puts it, becomes accessible by the meaning of these messages, guided by the repatterning. That repatterning is the foregrounding. De-automatization. To try to interpret the grammar in terms that go beyond its direct realizational function. It's not just what Halliday is saying, de-automatization, that covers what you see in Hassan's ideas about foregrounding, but that also covers what you see in terms of what goes on in terms of the grammatical metaphor in the language of science. The partial freeing of the lower level systems, partial freeing, the freeing up of the grammar. It's no longer tied to the semantics. You're freeing it, and you can make the choice as you wish. I'm going to represent this process, not as a verb. I'm going to represent it as a noun. That's de-automatization. That is grammatical metaphor. Metaphor is de-automatization. So in the poet, when it comes to verbal art and extended metaphor, you're creating an automatization from the totality of clauses that make up the text, creating a pattern to break the pattern. And we saw this in Les Murray's The Widower. This is what I wanted you to illustrate, to show that these were the kinds of ways in which the grammar was employed to create a kind of automatic that created. So when you talked about extended metaphor, I was disappointed when it would just be the widower in the country is about loneliness, bereavement. No, it's not just that there is a theme. How was it made? How do you explain that in terms of de-automatization? How do you explain the metaphor? In the works of Tambu, there's so many examples. The gods can die, the duality, the symmetry that is throughout, that creates that automatic. And against that, though, in order to illustrate the poet's point that it is about which side of us prevails, when is the balance lost? When the balance is lost, gods can die. That's Tambu's point. But it's not so much about the final interpretation of the poem. Yes, that's there. But what I really want you to get at, because we're not a literature course, but we are, in fact, text linguistics. So how does the text itself contribute to the meaning which is being conveyed? So when we look at Gods Can Die, you have this beautiful kind of level after level after level of parataxis, which then is broken up when the poet wants to get to that point where the poet is saying the balance has been lost. The side of him that prevails is not the good side. It is not those good humanistic impulses. It is when gods die, and that is when it turns into the hypotactic. But we've discussed this, and this is what I wanted you to get at. I want you to see the idea that when we talk about a text, when we talk about its meaning, when we talk about its response, find the reason in the grammar. And that means when you're looking at a poem, that means looking for the background, looking for the ways in which those habitual patterns of language choice have been mobilized and then turning into a particular consistency, which is not the usual. So paratactic, that's the pattern he creates against which he foregrounds with hypotaxis. This is the lesson to learn. Yes, the poem is about his frustration. It's the poet's disdain for what power has done to the relationship between him and his friend. But how does that come through? It comes through in the foregrounding, the hypotaxis that disturbs what would otherwise be a very balanced state of affairs. In this course, you need to be looking at the text itself. You're looking at, so question 1, question 2, both of them are really going about it the same way. Thinking about meaning means thinking grammatically. That applies here too. Thinking grammatically. I won't go through the rest of these and illustrating and so forth. I mean, a poet reading, that one is so, if you want an example of mobilizing the habitual patterns, all of the ing verbs, what were they getting at? Ongoing activity. Repeating the conjunction as. What was the poet doing? He was communicating this idea of simultaneity. The point is, these choices, taking these and creating a pattern, that is what contributes to it being an extended metaphor, where the overall meaning that's going to come out of it is the product of the choices that have been made in the grammar for the totality of the text. Third question. Eric Steiner describes the concept of register as a key organizing concept linking context and lexicogrammar. Yes, he goes on to say he has not found any such discussion concept anywhere else in modern linguistics. So I'm asking you, discuss the concept of register. What is a register? How does it link up context and grammar? And again, give examples from lecture to support your answer. I repeated that for each question. I will do the same when it comes to the exam. I will ask you to be able to cite examples. Because you see, what I want to make sure is that when you're writing that essay, when you're writing down all these concepts, that it isn't just sort of rehashing what you see in the PowerPoint slides of the wording and so forth, and you don't really get it. You don't really understand what's being talked about. The only way I know that you know what you're talking about, the only way I know that it makes sense to you, is that you can see it in the way language works. And that's by looking at examples. That's why I make such a point of, when we talk about a concept, illustrating it through examples. That's the whole point of a text linguistics course. It's not concepts only. Register. What is a register? It is defined, it is the way we use language defined according to our use in a context of situation. And how is context of situation defined? This goes back to the mentor for Halliday, J.R. Firth. He talks about field, tenor, mode. Field, it covered, the three metafunctions are covered, so that you can see the meaning as it relates to the nature of the situation. Field, what are you talking about? What's the topic? Tenor, who is talking to whom? Mode, how is it taking place? It's all three. When you talk about the context of situation, it's all three, because it relates to the three metafunctions: the experiential, the interpersonal, the textual. The context metafunction hookup hypothesis. What's the point that Hassan is making? A bi-directional relationship. On the one hand, how we understand the context in which we are in, it's on the basis of the way people are using language. Our perception of the context, it activates certain choices, choices of meanings. How we understand what's going on depends on the context and how we are going to express. It's not only our choice of meaning in the sense of how we speak it, it's how we understand it. How the context is perceived will very much influence the way you understand me speaking to you now. But on the other hand, how those meaningful choices are realized contributes to the construal of context. What you see, the choices that you make also make the context. You create the context by the way you speak. It works both ways. That's what she's saying. Context influences language. The language influences our perception of the context. But they are intertwined. And what results is a register. What is a register? A register is this context and meaning intertwined, forming a way of speaking. Now remember, our priority is meaning. We don't use a form and then ascribe to it some meaning. No, in fact, we have a meaning which we then take some form to use to express our meaning. Meaning comes first. The form that it takes comes next. But all of this is going to be very much related. The context is very much intertwined with the meaning. Now, when you talk about register, of course you would take examples from the language of science, where there is already a very well-defined semiotic system, a way of speaking. And how did this come about? Because there had to be a way to express some of these ideas. There needed to be new ways of organizing the grammar, new ways of using the grammar. So we're back to grammatical metaphor. Taking the way that we normally see the world, taking the congruent, the common sense reality, and trying to impose a regularity on it. to bring it more within our power to control. That was the purpose of science, and that was what created this tendency to nominalization. And that tendency to nominalization has come to define this register. So that the examples that we've illustrated already, there is this shift. The shifts, the verbs, the adjectives becoming nouns, conjunctions becoming verbs. These are taking place, but they come to be taking place with such an intensity. David Butt talks about a novel intensity. They become so frequent, they become the way we speak. The instances of language, the shifts, become the way language, they become language. They become the system of language. So that was the test. Now, yes, I was, those of you that only wrote half of the minimum word requirement, you really got to work harder. Many of you did well. One person submitted an assignment for another course. I hope that person just sincerely made a mistake, but I'm waiting to hear. But there has to be a real clarity in terms of understanding what we're trying to look at here. And I hope that what you realize is that when, for example, these homework tasks where you're looking at how to analyze the clauses, how to analyze for theme, you did transitivity, and next you will be doing logical. I hope that it's beginning to sort of come together with a realization that what you're looking for are patterns. Because yes, there is definitely, it is a text that has been deliberately crafted in a particular way, taking what we've been talking about mobilizing the habitual patterns of language choice. It's just normal language. It's mobilizing the habitual patterns of language choice into a non-habitual consistency. There is, though, something going on here. There is a patterning that is taking place here, a pattern that is being created through the text. It is the texture of a text. I previously, when I discussed it, said that Halliday calls it the personality of the text. And that personality of the text itself is derived from observing, patterning of choices, whether it be theme or transitivity or logical. And again, it isn't to say that there aren't other aspects of language at work. There are. But for now, we're limiting our focus to these, to see if there is indeed a kind of patterning that will emerge. And that's what I want you to be going back to go through. Now, question. I was asked, well, when you do your final commentary, should you base it on your analysis or the model analysis? Base it on the model. On that model analysis that I've given you after every round as we've gone through it. It's there, it's uploaded for you. Now it contains both the theme analysis, the transitivity analysis. Now you might say, well, then why did you need to? Because I do want you to, and the only way you're ever going to learn how to analyze a text in terms of these kinds of grammatical choices is to do it. So what you're doing is very important. And as you're doing it, you will begin to get a feel for the patterning. You'll begin to see things repeated. And that's why it's necessary for you to engage with the text, to analyze the text. The transitivity, as I said, I've uploaded it to Canvas, and it's there, and you can take a look at it. And let me just go through some of the points. And a number of you indicated that you considered call to be verbal. There's quite a few of you. I disagree. Why I would disagree is, remember when you could say, well, call, isn't that a kind of verbal? I mean, you're calling someone. But pay attention to the fact that what we said was that we need to apply these tests, these grammar tests. And what did we say about a mental or a verbal process? We said that they should project. Be able to take, in other words, like a that clause. Call cannot. So for that reason, I would put it in the category of doing. What it is a kind of doing kind of process, all right? So I've put call into the material column, into the doing column. Am, that's very obvious. Say, clearly verbal. And in fact, what follows say is a projected clause. Say, let's just say that they call me. The that isn't there, but really it is a projected clause. Okay, what else on this screen that we're looking at? For, again, am, relational, call, material, admit. Okay, now what would be admit? Now I won't say that it's material. Why? Because it can project. He admitted that he was wrong. It can project, it can take a that clause. So in order to be able to discern what is the kind of sort of category in which to put these verbs, it is important to, as far as possible, use the tests that we've outlined in terms of, you remember the three, right? When it's a doing kind of process, what did X do? What did X do to Y? All right. When it's can it project? What about the one that is doing it? Must it have a sense of consciousness? These are the questions. All right. The next lot. All right. Screamed. Now, make sure. Now, I've been thinking about that. Screamed. That first of all. Let's clear the air there. That is verbal. All right. Screamed. She screamed that. You can take a that clause. Make sure. Sure really should be treated as a kind of adjective. It shouldn't be treated as part of the process. Now, there could be is it a kind of, is the verb itself to make sure? In that sense, makes for some questions. When you say to make sure, well, it does project. But make requires a kind of sort of making it definite, right? Make sure, do it, all right? So we have two words here. It is make one sure that, All right, and so the sure is, one could really treat it as a kind of adjective, and make as a kind of verbal process, which is material. And in fact, in the Excel file, that's how I treated it. I've always sort of had a certain struggle with dealing with make sure, how to actually treat it. All right, and so let's go on. Call, you get there, but that's different get than is like in 7, because in 7 it's like I get. The same verb can have different meanings, and if they have different meanings, they may be different types of process. And in this case, 7, get does mean to understand. It can project, like I get that you're unhappy about something. All right, I get that. All right, it can project. In this case, it is a different kind. It is a different meaning than what we see in 6. Says, clearly verbal. To be, the verb to be, we know it's relational. Understand, clearly mental. Praying. Well, can it project? Can it take a that clause? I pray that. Now, is it mental or verbal? Well, you can pray out loud. So in this sense, I take it as a kind of verbal process. To leave, again, kind of material process. The verb to be, the verb to have, those are already relational, clearly. Protect. We've already dealt with call. Who longs. Now this one, again, I had a bit of struggle with how to deal with it. Longs. To long for something does seem to be related, definitely a kind of mental process, right? But it doesn't take a that clause. He longs that. It doesn't seem to me to be a verb that that projects. So there is a sort of there's a difficulty here. It seems so obviously kind of something sort of mental. Is it behavioral? Perhaps behavioral, in the sense that you have difficulty to say that it's mental because it doesn't behave like other mental processes, but it also is not, you don't feel so much as like a material process, all right? Who longs? Maybe that's a behavioral process. That would be a compromise, all right? To turn, watch, go or went as material. To understand, mental, realize, love. I loved. "13, bother. Doesn't really bother me. Bother does mental, it can project. Bothered that you're unhappy. All right. I mean, okay, mean as a kind of mental process. I mean that, again, it's a kind of expression. I mean is something about what it's what I would be taking to be the meaning of something. I mean, all right. So I take it as a mental process. The rest are clear on this page. Continuing. We're coming to the end of the first session. I want to be sure to cover this. As I stared at the screen, now, sorry, the coloring there should be it is behavioral, all right? Stare at something, all right? Behavioral. See if there's anything else here that seems to be existing, existential. That's one verb that's very obvious by the word itself. The rest, I think, are quite straightforward. Again, here, nothing I think that is controversial. 19, breathing. Breathing, I take as behavioral, all right? Pulsing, some of you I noticed also thought that was behavioral. I didn't consider it that because it's blood. It's not, normally with a behavior, you have a behavioral process, you have a behavior, which again is, it like a mental process, it is something which has a sense, this human-like. Blood is not the case here, all right? I would therefore put it in the material column. Warned, again, that is verbal. Need, I've put as mental. Again, it's almost like in the same category as longing, except I need that you can put a that clause after it, so it clearly would be mental. Promise, verbal. The rest, I think, should be straightforward. That pretty much covers. So we'll pause it there, and if you have questions when we come back, feel free to ask about that. And then when we come back, I will be going on to talk about the logical analysis, all right, of the golden buzzer text. All right, so let's take a break in the meantime, and we'll come back after that, okay? Okay, sorry. I'm a bit distracted by the good questions coming in. There's a good question here. Why is stare behavioral while look material? That has, again, caused me to pause a bit because I can see something, yeah, stare at the, yeah, look at, I have to think about that. That's a very good question. At first glance, I'm beginning to wonder, yes, maybe should look be considered behavioral too. I have to think about that before I commit myself one way or the other, but that's a very good question. And
No problem.
what would be the judgment? Stare at, look. Both of them would be taking a kind of stare at something, look at the picture. Both of them would behave much the same grammatically in terms of taking a sort of a circumstance that follows. Okay, let me think about it. But my first question, my first inclination is to think maybe yes, maybe we should consider look behavioral. Let me think about that question. All right, in the meantime, come back here. If we can move our thinking to the logical, all right? And now a question had come up to, someone asked me, what about these colored, why have I used the coloring here? Basically because as I was looking at it and I was sort of noticing that there was at the very beginning, the text seems to be rather simple. We have a number of really just simple clauses. I have two facts for you. One, I'm 6 feet tall. And then 3 is, because it has an embedding in it, but otherwise is a simple clause as well. And what we see in terms of 4, you must learn to hold on to it loosely, so when it leaves, it won't exit so painfully. Now, can I just go through with you how I analyze 4? It doesn't fit this sort of simple clause. that what we saw before. I mean, in terms of 1 through 3, but it does have this introduce 4 and 5 do introduce something, and that is and you must learn to hold on to it loosely, so when it leaves, it won't exit so painfully. That loosely, painfully, there's a rhyme there, all right? And so something is going on here, all right? And I do notice something sort of a bit more simple about the beginnings of this spoken word performance. It starts off on really a rather simple kind of structure, very much different than when we get to like 13 and so forth. All right, so let's take a look. First of all, for AB, you must learn to hold on to it loosely. All right, so to hold on to it sort of purpose, so that's why I consider it enhancement. For B is the dependent clause. You must learn is the main clause, so the alpha clause. That would explain the AB under enhancement. AB, though, goes together. And how is it related to CD? So, well, so 4C carries on with it. And so is considered usually a kind of coordinate clause conjunction. So it would be considered paratactic. C and D, again, the relationship is here, though a bit reversed. So the D is it won't exit so painfully. That's the alpha clause. And the C clause is the dependent clause, when it leaves. So the conjunction so is what we see combining A, B, and C, D. That's one relationship, a paratactic relationship. Also enhancement. So, meaning cause and result. What do I put under enhancement? Concession, cause, all the where, when, why, how, all the circumstances. These we would put under the enhancement category. All right, so that I think we can see for 4, it's how it broke up. 5, on July 14th, 1996, an angel was brought to this earth. Her name, Danielle Marie Gibson, but I only know her as Puff. All right, so this again, we have a sort of an extension. Again, it's paratactic. And again, introduced by the conjunction but. Then 6, 7, 8, again, are simple clauses. 9, looking at it with me on your screen, hopefully. 9, looking at it, you can see again we have some embedding here. What it meant, I would put 9B and C together. I make one correction here. I won't put B and C. C is in its own square brackets. Or I would consider that as being together, B and C in one embedding. 10. 10, again, we have some embedding. For on days in which my strength was knee-high, all right, B is clearly embedded. 10A, again, is continuing, all right, because that would be the sort of the adjunct at the beginning. It's sort of giving the circumstance. For on days in which my strength was knee-high. Now we get to the subject of 10A, which is itself an embedding. Seeing her smiling face would make my soul fly. All right. So then we have C as an embedding. It's a nominalization that is functioning as the grammatical subject. All right. So again, though, it would be in this case, what we do, there's only one sort of clausal connection, and that again is between A and D. All right, would make my, okay, and I'm here taking D as a kind of result, all right, make my soul fly, so treating it as a kind of result, so a kind of enhancement. All right, so that explains 1 through 10, all right. Not very difficult to analyze, and as long as we've already done the clauses, the breakup of the clauses and the embedding. So now it's just a matter of seeing how they sort of connect up with each other. As you can see, we're only connecting up, the clause analysis is only of those clauses that are functioning at clause level. So no embedded clauses, no rank shifted clauses. No, like for example, 10C, the nominalization functioning as a grammatical subject. That we're also putting into this category. All right, so we are only connecting up those clauses which are what we would consider functioning at clause level. All right, next slide. Eleven is an A, let's see, A and BC. But on March 23rd, 1997, I've been ground bound. B, because she left Earth. B and C first go together. She left Earth. 11C as a kind of purpose enhancement of B. So B and C together, but then together they also are a kind of enhancement, cause and result, indicated by because. So we have to sort of think of it hierarchically in terms of the logical structure. 12 is not difficult. I was left here to manufacture wings out of tears and broken dreams. Again, a purpose. And 13 gets to be a bit more difficult. And you can see it's quite complicated, not only in terms of embedding, but also how these clauses connect up. So one thing that I suggest to you is that when you're doing something like looking at how to analyze it, a good idea is usually to sort of map it out and before you start trying to put it into the table. So when I put it visually, I think we can see it a bit more clearly, all right? So I have cos 13b. Okay, cos would be, again, now, because we can treat it here as a kind of enhancement, all right? Unfortunately, putting it like this, you don't see that, all right? But look at it on, just for now, can I just go through, show you sort of graphically how I've sort of did this. Now, I have to do it that way. If I'm asked to put it in the boxes here in the Excel spreadsheet, I would have difficulty sort of being able to wrap my mind around it, especially when it gets rather complicated. So let me explain the visual part first, all right? So B through J is the because, all right, the cause. Now, that breaks down into, because I have a really creative mind, 13C. So 13B, I have a really creative mind. C, and I take it to be the rest of it. And sometimes it designs these alternate realities and goes on, all right? So it's between B and C through J. Then C is again and, okay, C, sometimes it designs these alternate realities, 13D, where it's still, she is still here, is still alive. E and all, E through H, and all the things. I wish we could have done our played again and again and again. E, again, with H and J is and. H and J is again and J is H. Let's see, where is H? And. Yeah, H through J, H and J. How would we, let's see, H, 13J is again cuz, and relates the E with, now let me go back here. C with E and H, and. E is and. H is and the relationship of H and J is enhancement cuz. All right. I don't really need that and at the bottom there. That one more or less just to illustrate. All right, the connection between each one of those. Yes, we have C, E, and H all beginning with and. All right, so indicating a kind of paratax 3. We have cause indicating enhancement twice, and we have 3 times of and indicating 3 kinds of parataxis. And those then, after I've drawn it like this, I find it much easier then to put that into sort of my categories here and be able to appreciate the levels that are there. So let's go back 14. Let's go down 14. And again, this one is, that's the cost of love, B through G. Caring for someone so much that you can't imagine living life without them. Staring at a grave, like how about I trade my 6 feet for yours, but that's not real, all right? So that's the cost of love. That's the main clause, 14A. And then you have B through G, which is sort of an elaboration. What does that mean? That's the cost of love. Caring for someone and on, all the way from B through G. But then B, caring for someone so much, 14C, again, a kind of that you can't imagine, again, a kind of elaboration. In fact, each of these clauses is elaborated by the next. So we have so many layers of A is elaborated by B through G. B is elaborated by C through G. C is elaborated by D, that you can't imagine living life without them. That's why you also have the punctuation, the commas, and so forth. E, this C through D is, again, together, elaborated by E through G, and E is elaborated by F. Okay. Staring at a grave, like how about I trade my 6 feet for yours? A lot of sequence of several kinds of elaboration, all right? Again, hierarchically put. E and F, finally, to conclude that 14, E through F, what is E through F? It won't exit so painfully, but if this pain and these memories are all that I got left of you, oh, the if, all right? I won't never regret these scars from just trying to hold on to you. All right, so E and F. Okay, now I'm 14. I don't see why I put E and F together and as a kind of extension with G. Let me take a look at this again. So when it leaves, it won't exit so painfully, but if this pain and these memories it should be E, it won't exit so painfully. I think I've got that. Let me make sure I'm looking at the right one here. E and F. E, staring at a grave. Sorry, I was reading the wrong one. Staring at a grave. Like, how about I trade my 6 feet for yours? Ah, yes, but that's not G, but that's not real. Yes, that is the paratactic extension. Now, I was confusing it with 15. And 15, again, several layers again. Now, do you notice something about what we're looking at? 13, 14, 15. So much more complicated than how it began. Is there a meaning in that itself? The idea that life has become so complicated, and the grammar more or less reflects that complication. All right. Looking at 15. All right, and I know. So we look back at this would be a projection A, and that is going to be projecting B through E. I know that projects 15B through E. I said earlier to hold on to love loosely, so when it leaves, it won't exit so painfully. All right, 2 projections here. I know that projects 15B through 15E. And then B, I said earlier, B projects C through E. All right, so one is I know what I know and what I said. So we have a mental and we have a verbal, both of them projecting one within the other. All right, so a double kind of projection here. The F is but, and then that sort of is a kind of parataxis. F through H is going to be paratactically with A through E. We've captured that. C, let me see, 15C, to hold on to love loosely. So, and that is repeating basically what we saw earlier in terms of, again, that same kind of to hold on to love loosely, so when it leaves, it won't exit so painfully. Basically repeating the same pattern that we saw previously. Let's carry on. But if this pain and these memories are all that I got left of you, so we have an if, F, which is related, that we can see the enhancement column, hypotaxis. F with G embedded is the beta clause, and H, I won't never regret these scars from just trying to hold on to you, as the main clause in the enhancement. Ooh, complicated. Of all 3 kinds of analysis, the logical I find the most difficult, because it, especially not like at the beginning, all right? I mean, at the beginning, when we analyzed simple clauses and simple parataxis or hypotaxis, very straightforward, very easy. But then when we get beyond that into, especially when we get into 13, 13 really takes on so many levels. And that's why I suggest to you, map it out. And that's what I do when I have a very complicated, I did it for 13, I also did it for 14. As I go through it, if I have difficulty sort of being able to sort it out, I visualize it. And that visualization helps me then know how to be able to fill in the spreadsheet, fill in the template that I have. All right, so I think it's time for us to sort of change the subject. Let's move on to something where Halliday did, and this is something I've been wanting to include, and we never seem to have time for it. So I wanted to be sure to mention it today. Halliday did a study of Darwin's Origin of Species. And he was so impressed with the whole, with what Darwin was writing, yes, and not just looking at it from the standpoint of language of science, but he almost considered it a kind of literature. Science as literature. I mean, it was the way it was constructed really struck him as being a kind of almost verbal art. The quote we've seen before, that at the very end of it, what is important, we should be able to use the same theory, method, linguistic analysis. I've mentioned this quote before. I want you to notice what else he says, and this is on the previous page. This was page 186, and I'll read it. I do not know how long it took Darwin to compose these two paragraphs. He's talking about the last two paragraphs of Origin of Species. I do not know how long it took Darwin to compose these two paragraphs, or whether he reflected consciously on their construction as he was doing it. I imagine not. I certainly had no idea, this is Halliday speaking, when starting the analysis of what I was going to find. I had the sense of a remarkable and powerful piece of writing as the climax to a remarkable and powerful book. And it struck me that something of the effect of these two paragraphs might lie in the patterning of the theme and of the new. Now, you know what those are. That is, in the textual component within the grammar of the clause. It is important to stress that that is, in fact, all that I have been looking at in this paper. I've said almost nothing about cohesion or transitivity or mood or the clause complex or any of the other lexicogrammatical systems, processes that go into the makeup of a text. Some, at least, of these other features would undoubtedly show interesting and significant patterns if we were to analyze them with this or some comparable kind of functional grammatics. He continues, it is pointless to try and classify a text like this, to ask whether it is a scientific treatise or a declaration of faith or an entertaining work of literature. It is a product of the impact between an intellectual giant and a moment in the space-time continuum of our culture with all the complexity of meaning that implies. And he goes on. You got the picture. He's focusing on theme. He's focusing on the textual component. And he's not saying that these others don't matter, but he's saying that this is what struck him as perhaps contributing to not only his response, but others' response to this text, and in particular, the last two paragraphs. Now, again, we are approaching this text following what he said, and this again comes from the other page at the very conclusion, what he says. What is important is that we should be able to use the same theory and method of linguistic analysis, the same grammatics, whatever kind of text or subtext we are trying to interpret, whether Tennyson or Darwin, Mother Goose, or the Scientific American. Otherwise, if we simply approach each text with an ad hoc, do-it-yourself kit of private commentary, we have no way of explaining their similarities and their differences, the aesthetic and functional values that differentiate one text from another, or one voice from another within the frontiers of the same text. Now, he says this word, grammatics. What does it mean, grammatics? What does it mean? It means exactly what we are doing here. It is, to think about meaning means thinking grammatically. This thinking grammatically. And by grammatically, what are we talking about? We're looking at the wording that realizes the meaning. That's what he's meaning by grammatics. You have linguistics. But he's saying this is grammatics. This is looking at how the grammar is being used in order to be able to make meaning. By applying sort of this method and being able to apply it to any kind of text, we can compare texts aesthetically and functionally. Those are two very important terms, the aesthetic and the functional. For a text is both. How we value it, how we consider it. Is this, as he said, is this art? Is this a piece of literature? Aesthetically, how do we understand it? Functionally, what was the point? What was Darwin trying to say? Okay, now, let me sort of come to the sort of conclusion before I go back. He's looking at theme and he's looking at new. Under theme, he's going to identify, and how is he going to identify what he categorizes as theme? It's how each of those clauses that make up the text, how they begin. That's what we know to be theme, right? The same way that we've been analyzing theme for this spoken word performance. He went through the text and what he identified was theme. And when he did so, what he found was, and remember, what did we say that one significance of theme is what? That it presents to us the method of development of the text. The method of development, how it unfolds. Think of the text as sort of unfolding, and as it does, what is being laid out for you as the train of thought that is being expressed here, how the text is developing, how it is unfolding. And what he's saying is that as we look at it, we'll see that it begins on the basis of authorities. And then it will move on to talking about the phenomena of species. And it will talk about inhabitants and groups, life form and endowments, variation. And it will finally conclude on sources, the law of nature, the war of nature. Now, these would all be then mentioned at the beginning of the clauses that make up the text. Think of it again, as I said, think of it as sort of the tracking our way through the text. And what we are highlighting is the beginning, and we're seeing sort of the train of thought of Darwin as he's presenting this. But what's the new information then? What comes toward the end of the clause? We said it's sort of the new information. And Halliday describes it as the main point. And again, there he outlines again a series of sort of ideas that are being raised toward the end of each clause. All right, so let's look first of all at the theme.
Huh?
I'd like to ask you to take a minute, and I'd like you to take a look at the text that you see on your screen, all right? I'm not going to read it. Would you please take a look at it? Okay, now you have some idea what he's saying and so forth. And remember, this is the concluding paragraphs of Darwin's work, Origin of Species. What Halliday goes through and does is this: he looks at as I say, sort of tracking it through, and authors of the highest eminence. It begins with an authority. We notice something here of, and it has to be understood in terms of modality. It's not just in terms of it's Halliday mentions it, but it doesn't really relate to theme as much as I highlighted here in orange. All right, and as we're going through it now, we have authors of the highest eminence seem to be. So it seems, all right. To my mind, in 2A begins, to my mind. Now notice he's gone from authors of the highest eminence to his opinion, to my mind. When now he's changed it to first person. Then he goes back to seem to me. So we have still this sort of, in a way, seem to be, seem to me, sort of, as we've called before, hedging, all right? He's qualifying it. He's not saying it with such certainty. Then he gets to 4, judging from the past. So we've gone from other authorities. To my mind, it accords better with, I put it in gray, but it's important, what we know of the laws impressed on matter by the Creator. Okay, but it's our view. All right, so gone from, we're sort of establishing, first begin with authorities of highest eminence, and then our opinion, our view, to my view. And then it becomes first person, I. Then 4 comes back to the past, judging from the past. We. Now notice we, 4B, 6A, we, 7B, we, 8, we. What's happened here? He's gone from it being his view, to my mind, I, to on the basis of the past, we. Now, yes, modality is there, which does sort of hedge it. We may, we can, we may, but it's we. And so as we're going through it, you'll notice that it is establishing sort of the basis on which he has moved from what authorities in the past said to himself, to we. And we are inferring this, all right? So we do notice that it isn't, but I want you to notice something about how we may infer 4B, but 6A, we can so far take a prophetic glance into the futurity as to foretell. And then 7B, we may feel certain. Yeah, he hedges it, but we may feel certain. We may look with some confidence. Not only is it moving from I, but it's moving to we, and the level of sort of confidence is gradually also increasing. Then he moves on to, after sort of building up this sort of, now to the point where we may feel quite certain, and what? Now he goes on to talk about species, life forms, differentiation. I've highlighted it in green, which he breaks up into which Halliday breaks up into 3 categories: inhabitants, species, groups, living forms, forms of life, birds, insects, worms, constructed forms, all right, that's second category. And finally, what I've highlighted in red, production, extinction of the past, present inhabitants, and so on. Okay, so he's sort of outlining what are these sort of things that are identified here in sort of theme position. And he's sort of categorizing them into the conceptually. And so we're getting sort of a conceptual idea of what the text is about. And finally, the last part is he shifts to sort of a third category. Remember these laws, war of nature, from so simple a beginning. This is toward the end then of the beginning, the source. Okay, so he does the same with new. Again, I'm not going to ask you, this is the same text, so no need to read it. Again, he's looking at it from the standpoint, what is in the sort of end of each of these clauses? And there's sort of an explanation. It goes from creation to evolution. Next is looking at transmission. And again, I'm not going to go through all the details here of what he's identifying. Now you might say, so what now? Okay, so we can see sort of a tracking of these ideas through the text. We're not done yet. These motifs that are established at the beginning in terms of theme and are established in new. What he's saying is this is what Halliday's point is. These motifs culminate in a resounding lexicogrammatical cadence that brings the clause, the sentence, the paragraph, the chapter, and the book to a crashing conclusion with a momentum to which I can think of no parallel elsewhere in literature. What Halliday is saying is that when you look at that last sentence, the last sentence, and I'll read it. There is grandeur in this view of life with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one. And that whilst this planet has gone cycling on, according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Halliday's point is this. Take that table that you see at the bottom of your screen, the one that we've been looking at, the one that we've observed in terms of choices of theme and choices of new. These sort of categories that he has outlined here, and the progression as it proceeded through the text. Now, what do you notice? All of these are now being brought together in that last paragraph. Not just the last paragraph, I'm sorry, the last sentence. This last sentence takes all of these ideas that have been sort of developed in the last two paragraphs of Darwin's Origin of Species, takes them all and brings them all together into that final sentence. That's why Halliday refers to it as this crashing conclusion, because he brings the clause, the sentence, the paragraph, the chapter, the book to a crashing conclusion where all of the things that have been mentioned here in these last two paragraphs, all the things that have been established both as theme and as new, are now rehearsed and recaptured. There is grandeur, ennoblement. In this view of life with its several powers, life forms, endowments from theme. Having been originally breathed, transmission from new into a few forms or into one, inhabitants and groups from theme. And that's whilst this planet has gone cycling on, time, past, future, also from new, according to the fixed law of gravity, from theme. From so simple a beginning, the sources, from theme, endless forms, variation, theme, most beautiful and most wonderful, ennoblement. have been and are being evolved. I mean, one can have, it's regardless of the science, regardless of how one feels about evolution, this is not at issue here. What is at issue is the fact of how Darwin was able to capture all of these main points that now appear here in this, all wrapped up in this final sentence, are all the things that he has been putting at the beginning as theme and as new throughout those last two paragraphs, bringing them all together. And that's what, that was that crashing conclusion, that momentum that Halliday observed in this text. Theme captured it. New, theme and new, the textual component, what was being highlighted, what were being chosen as theme and as new. All of these now were being sort of brought back together and concluding with this last sentence. Now this is, you see, you don't have to say, well, you're not analyzing the whole text there. And there were other elements that we observed. There is the element of modality here, in which he sort of goes from a very kind of, this is my view, into one that is more we together, from one that we just simply infer to one that we may state with confidence. Yes, there is a progression that is proceeding interpersonally as well. But that is the progression that is being observed through the use of the grammar. You know, Halliday likes to use the word applicable. And he doesn't like to use the word applied linguistics. Why? Because, as he says, it's almost like applied linguistics has come to be sort of some opposition to linguistics. Like, if you do applied linguistics, you're not really doing linguistics. You have linguistics proper, you have linguistics, theoretical linguistics over here, and you have applied linguistics over here. Halliday says, I want to reject that. I want, he says, one single concept unifies the two. So not applied linguistics, applicable linguistics. I want a general term which gives, as he says, the sense of something that is capable of having evolved in the context of being applied. In other words, our knowledge of language is improved by looking at the text, looking at the way language actually is put to use, at the way language actually functions. And when we do that, looking at how language itself is being used and being applied, we will also be able to feed back into our knowledge of language and linguistics. The application of linguistics improves the theory of our language. Applicability tests the robustness of the theoretical framework. In other words, okay, if your linguistics works, how applicable is it? How useful is it? Can you identify the value of a text, the meaning of a text? Does the theory enable one to answer questions about how language means and how language is valued in actual use? Can you answer those questions with your theory of language, your linguistics? Well, if you're working within a systemic functional linguistics, I'd say yes. When we come back from the break, what I'm going to be talking with you about is an example. I was invited to be expert witness in a trial, and this is in Hong Kong. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. But what I was asked was from the legal team defending this individual, they were asking for some advice, linguistic advice, which they felt was important to their case. So in the next hour, that's what I'm going to be talking with you about, and sort of explaining to you what happened and how I was able to use my linguistics to be able to have something to say. All right, so we'll talk about that more when we come back after this next break. All right, so it's now, let's see, now about 8:53, so about a little after 9. We'll be back. See you then. Okay, welcome back, and let me continue with my story. We don't simply ask whether or not a sentence is grammatical, because form by itself can provide only a partial and thus unsatisfactory picture of how language works. Instead, we ask how language functions in context of situation. Function is determined by how users respond. So, when I am asked for advice, I'm going to have to be looking at language in the context of situation and looking at how users respond. All right, remember, keep in mind our notion of register, and remember that what we're talking about here is the use of language in a given context. And all the things that we've been mentioning so far about register here apply. How the speaker perceives the situation will activate choices, certain meanings, and they are realized by the choice of wording. These meaning word choices that we make, activated by context of situation, form an instance of some registral variety, a register whose correlate is some specific category of context. All right, so Hassan also, besides the notion of field, tenor, mode, sort of looks at it in terms of 3 domains. Action. What is going on? Relations, who is acting with whom? And contact, how they've been brought into contact. She says this: examining action, relation, and contact, ARC, from the perspective of language as text, which is how we are approaching it, right? Reveals the reach of language in human life. Every instance of context of situation holds in it what language has achieved for the community in the past action. In other words, what we perceive as the way to speak in a context of situation, that is something which is built up within a community through previous behavior. What it is doing in the present, what's happening now, and what might be anticipated on that basis in the future. So we're looking at it in terms of field, tenor, mode. Field is a kind of action. What is being talked about? Tenor, kind of relation, the interrelationships. Who is talking to whom? Mode, how are those that are engaged in conversation and discourse, how are they brought into contact to facilitate successful performance? So come back to the point. In real life, texts carry value. We've said this before. We've read this statement before of Halliday's. In real life, texts carry value. We need to explain that value in terms of what we know about semiosis, about meaning, and how meaning is made. You see, what I want you to leave this course knowing is understanding what is meaning and how meaning is made. So this is the challenge. The challenge of explaining the value of a text in real life in terms of what we know about how we make meaning. This is the challenge. This is the challenge to which we need to apply our knowledge of not just linguistics, but grammatics. This is the case. At his trial on the indictment of unlawfully trafficking the drug ice, the defendant was accused by the prosecution of knowingly concealing the drug ice in a game console in his luggage for transporting from Hong Kong to Auckland. This trial took place in 2019. So he was indicted as a drug trafficker, the drug ice. He had it in the game console in his luggage, and he was transporting from Hong Kong to Auckland, New Zealand. He pleaded not guilty. He denied that any knowledge of the dangerous drugs concealed in the game console. He claimed that he had been tricked into carrying the drugs. He was convicted. He was convicted by a jury presided over by a deputy high court judge, and I'm not mentioning the name, and sentenced to 23 years and 9 months imprisonment. So he was found guilty. So you might be asking, where was my involvement? Nothing here so far, nothing. He had a trial. He pleaded not guilty, but he was convicted by the jury, and he was sentenced 23 years and 9 months imprisonment. The defendant, let me explain a bit, is a Tongan from Tonga. His English is a second language. He speaks Tongan. Now you probably wonder, where is Tonga? Maybe you know already. Okay, it's like off, you can see at the bottom there, you have New Zealand, and then above it you have an island of Tonga. Now in the original trial, an interpreter was provided to interpret the court proceedings into Tongan for the defendant. Yes, his English was the second language, so it was determined that an interpreter was necessary. The jury, they're Hong Kong residents. Now, a notice of application for leave to appeal against the conviction was filed. And the hearing for the application for the appeal was not only allowed, this is the outcome, by the way. He appealed. It goes to the appeal court. This is where I was involved. Now, the hearing at which it was to decide whether to allow him to apply for appeal. Not only was the application to appeal allowed, but the appeal court justices quashed the conviction. They set aside the sentence and they ordered a retrial. Now, why did that happen? What was there about that first trial that made the court decide that that conviction should be put aside? A retrial should be ordered. What were the grounds of appeal? The appeal called into question whether the judges, now you're getting close to where I'm involved. The appeal called into question whether the judges summing up. Now, when the trial is nearly done, all the evidence has been given by both the prosecution and the defense. The last thing that happens before the jury goes to decide is that the judge sums up the evidence. So the appeal called into question, first of all, whether the judge's summing up of the evidence had been, first of all, adequately translated, arguing that failure to do so denied the defendant a fair trial. Now, so the summing up, was it adequately translated? The judge failed to maintain an adequate speed in his summing up, as a consequence of which the interpreter was unable to fully interpret the summing up to the applicant. Why was the defendant didn't receive an adequate translation from the translator? It is the appeal that's being put forward is on the grounds that the judge did not maintain an adequate speed in his summing up. He spoke too fast. That's basically what the defense was arguing. And that's basically the point of appeal. He spoke too fast. The interpreter couldn't keep up. The interpreter couldn't translate adequately. So ground two argued that the judge's summing up exceeded the ability of the trial interpreter to adequately carry out his task. Ground three, well, the low standard, the inaccuracy, the poor quality of interpretation deprived the applicant of a fair trial. You see, the court-appointed interpreter didn't have any experience as an interpreter. And so, as a result, he was unable to keep up with the translation. He mistranslated parts of the evidence. He failed to translate or correctly translate the evidence, and he omitted evidence. The three grounds. So the three grounds are related. First of all, the interpreter couldn't keep up, couldn't provide an adequate translation. One reason being the judge spoke too fast. The other reason being the interpreter just simply didn't have the skills required. So, ground three of the appeal. Failure of the interpreter to use the appropriate words or to interpret to an extent that fully reflected the answers given by the applicant could have conveyed the impression to the jury that the applicant was unresponsive, incoherent, inconsistent, or even being evasive. And this could have resulted in the jury making adverse findings against the applicant and ultimately influenced the outcome of the trial. So during the trial, the interpreter is interpreting, and if he's interpreting wrongly, misinterpreting, and sometimes not interpreting, well, the applicant, the defendant, might seem to be like he's not responding, but he's not getting the translation, or that he is not responding correctly. He is incoherent, inconsistent, evasive. But all of that impression could be the result of the fact that the interpreter was not interpreting well enough. Now, in their conclusion, the appeal court justices, the difficulties lay not with the language, but with the linguist. What did they mean by that? The difficulties lay not with the language. These are the appeal court justices. When they quashed that earlier verdict, when they threw away the sentence, ordered a retrial, they are saying the difficulties, the reasoning behind that is not to do with the language, but to do with the linguist. What do they mean by the linguist? Well, they elaborated a bit. Before concluding this judgment, this is the appeal court justices, we should emphasize that even though we allow this appeal on grounds 2 and 3, we do not accept the assertion that the judge spoke at too rapid a pace. It was, of course, too rapid for Mr. B, the interpreter, but that was only because Mr. B was not a professional interpreter and lacked the skills needed to provide a simultaneous interpretation. All right, so what do they mean by not with the linguist? What they mean, the linguist is the interpreter. And what they're saying, it's not with the language. It doesn't have to do with the judge. It's not his problem. Not that he spoke too fast or too rapid. No, the problem is with the interpreter. It was too fast maybe for him. And that's because he wasn't a professional interpreter. He didn't have the skills needed to provide simultaneous interpretation. Now, a primary concern of the court, this was the original trial. In the original trial, you might say, well, why did they have to have an interpreter? He could speak English. It was his second language. The right to interpreter assistance is there in the law, a primary concern of the court. And this is the initial trial judge, not the appeal court. This is the original court. And the original judge, his view, his concern was that the defendant should not be at all, in any way, linguistically disadvantaged by his inability to understand, speak the language of the court. In fact, this is what the trial judge said. I am in agreement about the observations concerning his English, since I do try to take verbatim notes, and at times it was difficult, not because of the speed, but because of the use of language. I do not think it is something made up by the defense team. In other words, there was an argument at the beginning of the first trial whether he should receive an interpreter. Trial court judge concludes, so it's a real difficulty and it's a real risk that if the defendant is not properly expressing himself, then he may not be having a fair trial, or he may not eventually be regarded as having a fair trial. Well, that's the reasoning of the trial court judge. Yes, he feels if in any way he's linguistically disadvantaged and there's a desire for an interpreter, he should have an interpreter. The problem was that there are no Tongan interpreters in Hong Kong. None. So quite a bit of time was spent once this conclusion was decided that they needed an interpreter. Quite a long time passed for them to try to find an interpreter. Well, it just so happened that this was the time when you have the rugby sevens. And there was a team from New Zealand. And on that team from New Zealand was a Tongan. Well, at least he was born in Tonga, but he grew up in New Zealand. But anyways, they asked him, would you be willing to be the interpreter? Now, this is a rugby player. He has no experience at all in interpretation. And he's now asked, would you please come along and be the interpreter for this trial? I'll come back to the point. There is the right to interpretation. It is guaranteed by Hong Kong Bill of Rights. There are minimum guarantees that they should be informed promptly and in detail in a language which he understands of the nature and cause of the charge against him. To have free assistance of an interpreter if he cannot understand or speak the language in court. And these provisions are comparable to articles of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which applies to Hong Kong by virtue of Article 39 of the Basic Law. The defendant's right to interpreter assistance based on Article 11 extends to, encompasses all elements of the trial which affect the defendant's interests, assuring not only the defendant's comprehension, but also, more importantly, his meaningful participation in the trial, including his ability to make decisions on trial issues and give instructions to his legal representative on such issues. In other words, he has to be able to be a full participant in his own trial. And the only way to make sure that's the case is that he should be fully well aware of what's taking place in terms of what is spoken. Now, Mr. B, the interpreter, acknowledged that he said his Tongan was not at the level of a native Tongan speaker in Tonga. He was born in Tonga, but he was raised in, sorry, not New Zealand, raised in Australia. He was asked about his level of vocabulary in Tongan. He replied that while he can speak and write the Tongan language, there are parts of the older Tongan language that I don't understand or I can't speak. That's something probably directly linked to some of the words in law and stuff like that. He was asked to translate DNA into Tongan. He said that he could not. He didn't even know the word in Tongan for suspicion. So then the question was raised by the appeal court justices. They called the interpreter there and they asked him this question. Would it be right to say that if you felt that you were not up to the job of being an interpreter, you would have said so? Yes, he replied, and the fact that they said that there wasn't anybody else within the country, it was critical for somebody to be able to help to get the court proceedings underway, because there had been, from what I was told, there had been a fair bit of time that he was already incarcerated. Now, not only was he incarcerated, the jury had also been required to wait for this trial to resume while they searched for an interpreter. The jury originally had been under the impression that they would be able to be out of that case rather quickly, but it dragged on and dragged on and dragged on. And the jury started sending notes, quite nasty notes, to the judge, why they were being kept waiting for so long for this interpreter to be found, and the proceedings dragging on. Question was again asked to the interpreter, but if you felt that actually I'm not good enough to do this, you would have said so. He answered at the start, before I started, yes, I thought I was up for the job, but then obviously at the end of it, there's a lot more to it than I know. There's something you have to know about Hong Kong courts. Interpretation is simultaneous. It's not consecutive. Now, you have to realize that if it is simultaneous interpretation, that means that the defendant can only hear what the interpreter is saying to him. Everything is being channeled through the interpreter. The court realized that the defendant would have been listening to the interpreter, not the person speaking. So even if his English was able to follow, still he's got this voice in his ear interpreting, not very well, but nonetheless maybe perhaps more distracting than helpful. So that whatever was communicated by the interpreter then would have been lost on the defendant. So what was not communicated, whatever the interpreter missed, the defendant missed. Now this is the courtroom. You can see at the top of your screen, you have the defendant. He's sitting in the dock, and it has bars around it. And opposite is the judge's bench. You have three justices, three appeals court justices. The interpreter is sitting in a chair next to the defendant, speaking, talking to him in his ear, telling him what's taking place. It's nothing electronic. It is simply the interpreter sitting next to the defendant interpreting. Now, on the side, you see there is an interpreter's booth. And in that interpreter's booth is glass encased. It's soundproof. Now, that interpreter booth has never once ever been used. The interpreter sits next to the defendant. Why? Because the interpreter booth had some problem, electronic problem. They never fixed it. So the interpreter booth, even though it sits there, off there in the corner, never, ever once been used to this day. So Mr. B, the interpreter, is asked to estimate how much of the judge's summing up that occurred at the end, how much was he able to interpret? The interpreter admitted maybe 20 to 30%. Now, after hearing the interpreter's testimony, after getting the answers to their questions, the justices, the appeal court justices, said that the appeal is credible and compelling. They concluded this. When an interpreter says that he was only able to interpret 20 to 30% of what had been spoken and was unfamiliar with key words and phrases which were frequently being used in the course of the proceedings, we were compelled to conclude that the applicant had not been provided with constitutionally compliant standard of interpretation, one that met the purposes of Article 11(2)(f) rights. Okay, you're probably still wondering, where did I come in? Well, it goes back to that question. Did the judge speak too fast? So the defense team requested to have linguistic evidence provided that would address this question of whether the judge spoke too fast. Now, the legal department, in fact, is the one that contacted me, not the defense team. The defense team makes the request. Legal aid department follows up and contacted me and asked me, would I provide advice to the defense team? When I agreed, after all, it was being requested by the government itself, the legal aid department. So I agreed to do so. I met with the defense team and they asked me to go through the summing up and to examine it and to come back to them with a conclusion. What about the speed of delivery? Now, the prosecution, when they went during the appeal, they argued anyone, they said this, the prosecutor, this is in the appeal, anyone listening to the recording would conclude that the judge did not speak too quickly. He maintained that the trial judge spoke articulately and clearly, and what he said was easy to comprehend. Oh, the question is, would I agree with this from the prosecution? Would I conclude that the judge did not speak too quickly? Did he speak articulately and clearly? What he said easy to comprehend? So I did a linguistic analysis. I was provided with the audio recording of the summing up delivered by this deputy high court judge. The summing up was delivered over 2 days. This was on the 25th of April, first day. 70 minutes and 24 seconds, so it's longer than an hour and 10 minutes. On the second day, it's nearly 2 hours. So what is the summing up? The summing up is the judge basically reading his summary of everything that's transpired during the court case, all the testimony, all the evidence. And he reads this. Now, this is what I found. Here's the table, and you can see I've broken it up on the first day. There were opening remarks. And I'm counting the words per minute. 137 words per minute, opening remarks. And then before he gets to the summing up, he gives some directions, some important principles of law, directions of law, the elements of the offense, and those, as you can see, all roughly around the same, 144, 150, 145 words per minute. Then he gets to the summary of the evidence. First part was about 16 minutes long and 161 words per minute. It gets a bit faster. Now, the first day, he asked the jury, would they allow him to continue for an additional 15 minutes to get through a certain portion of the evidence. In that additional 15 minutes, he speeds up to 176 words per minute. Average, 155 words per minute over about an hour and 10 minutes. Second day, 2 hours, very nearly. 162, I broke it up into 30-minute intervals. 162 words, 174, 185, 197. Wow, almost got up to 200 words per minute. Averaging out 172 words per minute. Now, what can I say as a linguist about this? I mean, is this normal speed? Let's take a look. Considering the total number of words, total number of hours, the words per hour, all right? And then we can sort of look at the speaking rate, words per minute, as it proceeds through the day, and we can see that on the second day, it started off at 162, first day 137, so it's a bit faster and faster and faster until 197 words per minute, almost 200 words per minute. So, but it's not just the count, right? How does the judge's speed of delivery compare with a normal speaking rate, for this situation? Let's bring into it context of situation. And what does it mean, normal speaking rate? So let's do a little bit of fact finding. In the U.S., the 11th Judicial Circuit Court, I found out this information, estimates the average rate of speech during court proceedings, 150 to 160 words per minute. And that was based on what they expected a court reporter who would be taking, transcribing it, what they should be able to, the speed that they should be able to work at, 150, 160 words per minute. Now, if you go to California and you do a court interpreter certificate examination, you'll listen to a 3-minute tape, and the speed will be 140 words per minute. But you got to keep in mind something. We're talking about what takes place in a court. In a court, you have sometimes one of the attorneys, the defense or the prosecution might be asking a question. The witness is replying. In a court proceeding, you have different kinds of exchanges. Now, some are extemporaneous, meaning some are not scripted. But in the judge's summation of evidence, that is scripted. He's written it out beforehand. He's basically reading it to the jury. Differences in mode of delivery. The mode, spoken or written, scripted or free, that has consequences for the form that language should take. If you are reading from a prepared text, you tend to deliver faster. And you don't give it the pauses, the changes of pace, the repetitions, which are very significant, which convey meaning, which give the spoken language its immediate intelligibility. Now, there's another thing here. The defendant's counsel, second day, in the morning. This is during the trial. The defendant's counsel was told by the interpreter that he was having difficulty keeping up with the judge's pace of delivery. And the defendant's counsel said to the judge, told the judge in the court on the morning of the second day of that summation of evidence about this, and asked the judge to please slow down his pace of delivery. What did the judge do? The judge's delivery speed, instead of decreasing, became even faster. The judge's summary of evidence given by the defense's expert witness. Now, this is the point. He is summing up the evidence, and when he comes to the evidence that's provided by that is an expert witness called by the defense, that is when he got to be his fastest. During that 6 minutes, when he was talking about the expert witness, the evidence given by this expert witness on behalf of the defense, 6 minutes, 200 words per minute, the fastest of the whole length of the trial, the summation of evidence. Now remember, the judge is reading from a prepared written text. A court interpreter is performing essentially the same task as a translator of a written text. So when the interpreter is interpreting the judge reading his summation of evidence, what we're saying is that that's no different than a translator of a written text. But the interpreter has to do it at 200 words per minute. And that is 40 times faster than normal translating work. The basis for that calculation comes from United Nations, their requirement of translators, 6 to 8 pages, 2,000 to 3,000 words per day. 40 times faster. That's what was required of an interpreter. Commenting on this, I mean, given that speed, this absurd pace quickly reduces the interpreter to a state of mental and physical exhaustion. Now, we're talking about a professional interpreter. We're talking about professional interpreters. Reduces the interpreter to a state of mental and physical exhaustion. His usefulness to the listener is practically nil when compared to the service he is able to render when dealing with free speech. You know, that's not all, though. There's also the issue of grammatical complexity. There's a study, a famous study, Charles and Charles, their groundbreaking empirical study of how difficult it was to understand jury instructions, the judge giving instructions to the jury. And what they noticed were 3 kinds of grammatical complexities. The use of passive constructions in subordinate clauses. What they meant by this was like when you have an embedded clause, in that embedded clause, like a relative clause, it's in the passive voice. That's one. And we notice several occurrences of it. The other is many clauses within one sentence. And the third was what they called whiz deletion, the WH plus IS, meaning when you have a relative clause omitting the relative pronoun. So you can have that conducted on transference by way of an investigator's glove onto another surface, which involves both the embedding in a passive voice with the deletion of the WH relative pronoun. And you had some sentences in the text that the judge was reading that combined all three together. The passive voice and subordinate clauses, the whiz deletion, the combination of many clauses within one sentence. In other words, it wasn't just an issue of speed. It was also the grammatical complexity. On top of that, there's a third point, lexical density. When you are just speaking extemporaneously, there's about typically 2 content words in a clause. When you're writing, though, including what is written to be spoken, more likely it will be 4 to 6 content lexical words per clause. Now, Halliday says lexical density in scientific writing can go much higher. When it gets to around 13 or greater, 13 content words per clause, the text becomes difficult to comprehend. The judge's sentence, this example, 15 content words in this sentence. So I did an analysis through and looked at it from the standpoint of lexical density. This is what I find. And again, I'm going to come back to that 6 minutes when the judge spoke 200 words per minute. This during that period when the judge is summing up evidence that would be favorable to the defendant. Notice how many clauses have a lexical density of 10 or greater. In other words, we notice that there is not only an issue of how fast, it's how grammatically complex, how lexically dense, because what you are doing is the judge is reading what he has written. Other examples of ambiguous reference, I'll skip these. The demands of the register. The judge is delivering the summation of evidence, use of specialized legal terms. So it's legal terminology that is not just even the speed or complexity. It's a lexical kind of difficulty. The tenor, the judge is reading the summation to the jury. The interpreter is translating. Even if your interpreter was a professional interpreter, to be able to keep up that speed for that long, wow, that's difficult for the interpreter, but it's also difficult for anyone listening to be able to follow what's being said. The mode was written, it's a written statement read aloud by the judge to the jury for just 1 hour, for over 1 hour on day 1 and over 2 hours on the second day. Court interpreter was required to mentally process, interpret the judge's summing up into Tongan, which Tongan has the rarest major type of word order, verb initial. The court interpreter carrying out a speed of 40 times the speed of that required of United Nations translators of written documents. Is a high information load, substantial amount of technical jargon, complex grammatical constructions, all read at a pace which is, at some points, quite fast. It would have had to have taxed the mental processing of not just the interpreter, but also the jury. The receivers, the jury, the translators, how can they deal with the specialized legal terms? The interpreter is inexperienced. He didn't know that you could even ask the judge to repeat, to clarify points that I've already made about the high information load, technical jargon, complex grammatical constructions. My point is this: the question remains whether the defendant can be considered to have had a fair trial if only the trial judge's summing up has been called into question. Now, the prosecution argued back and said, well, you know, other cases have been put forward, and the summing up wasn't even interpreted at all, and it wasn't on that basis. There was no appeal accepted. The appeal court justices countered that, in fact, in that case which the prosecution had put forward, the judge had written out a substantial document and had given a hard copy of that document to the defense team. So they had in their hands, they could read along while the judge was reading aloud. That definitely would make a difference. Okay, so the defense team asked that I give this report. I gave the report, and I was there on the first day of the appeal hearing. They asked me to be there in case they would need to question me about the evidence that I was providing. The judges, the appeal court justices, had also seen my report at the very beginning of the hearing, and I'm about to close, so don't worry. At the very beginning of the hearing, the three judges came out. I was sitting where you have the witnesses to be sitting and so forth. And the defense team requested to put forward the appeal, requested for their application of the appeal to be accepted. And the trial court judges, first thing they said, it was funny, we do not want to hear from Professor Webster. I was really surprised. I mean, I was sitting there, and I hadn't been called on to speak yet, and the appeal was only, it had just started. They had just walked out. They had just sat down, and almost the first thing out of their mouths is, "We do not want to hear from Professor Webster." The defense team said, but he's been called as a witness, and his report has been given to the judges, and he should be here to answer questions if called upon to do so. And then the judges, the appeal court justice said, okay, we wait to see. Now, why did they not want to hear from me? My feeling is that they didn't want to hear the fact that the way the language is being used in the courtroom, the way the summation of evidence is given, for example, that it really doesn't just put the interpreter in a difficult role, it also is difficult for the jury to be able to comprehend, to sit for more than 2 hours and listen to someone read something which is high information load, grammatically complex, and delivered at a speed which is faster than normal because the person is in fact reading, and in fact also at the same time trying to move things along quickly. And the judges, they did not want to hear that, because they did not want to hear anything that would suggest that there is a problem with the language that's used, because that would have serious consequences. The defense team told me later that And they're worried about the floodgates. If you admit an appeal on the basis of the judge's use of language, how many more could appeal on those grounds? So it was clear. They, yes, gone on to approve the appeal and quash the conviction because the interpreter was so bad. Because so clearly the interpreter could not do his job. It was interesting for me, though, to look at what was taking place in the courtroom and taking a look at it from the standpoint of, from my linguistics, and observing and being able to comment on it. It's applying the linguistics that I do. And certainly learn something from doing so. Well, it's 10 to the hour, and you see, your linguistics is applicable, and that's important. So with that thought, let's finish tonight, and hope you have a good rest of the week, and keep working on your assignment, and see you next Monday. Okay? So I'll say good night. Bye-bye.